The summer sun hung heavy over Pine Creek, Texas, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. At a small wooden lemonade stand on the corner, Charlotte Davis, an 8-year-old with golden curls and an entrepreneurial spirit, carefully arranged plastic cups in a neat row. Her German shepherd Apollo lay in the shade beside her, his sharp brown eyes scanning the street with the precision of a seasoned protector. Though most would see just a loyal family pet, Apollo was far more than that. Before retiring, he had been one of the most decorated K-9 unit dogs in Texas law enforcement. "Do you think we'll sell out today, Apollo?" Charlotte asked as she straightened the hand-drawn sign that read, "Charlotte and Apollo's Fresh Lemonade, $1." Apollo's ears twitched, but his gaze remained locked on the road. A black SUV with dark-tinted windows crawled past them for the third time that morning. Across the street, Martha Stevens, the elderly woman who owned the town's antique shop, approached the stand with a warm smile. "Good morning, Charlotte. And good morning to you too, Apollo." "Hi, Mrs. Stevens. Would you like some lemonade? I made it extra fresh today." Charlotte beamed, pouring a cup. Martha handed over $1, but her gaze followed Apollo's. The black SUV was making another pass. Her smile faltered. "Have you noticed that car before, dear?" she asked quietly. Apollo's posture stiffened slightly as the vehicle slowed near the stand. The driver didn't stop, just observed. "That's the 4th time," Martha muttered under her breath. Just then, Frank Cooper, the owner of the local hardware store, walked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Morning, Charlotte." "Morning, Martha," he greeted, then looked down at Apollo. "And good morning to you, Officer Apollo." Apollo's tail wagged once in acknowledgement, but his attention didn't leave the SUV. Frank's tone shifted. "Been seeing some new faces in town lately," he said casually, though his eyes were sharp. "Any of them stop by your stand?" Charlotte, oblivious to the tension, happily poured him a glass of lemonade. "Nope, just regulars." "Would you like a cookie too, Mr. Cooper?" As she ducked beneath the stand to retrieve a container of cookies, Apollo suddenly rose to his feet. His movement was smooth, controlled, but unmistakably protective. The SUV had returned. This time it stopped. 2 men stepped out. They were tall, wearing sunglasses despite the shaded street. Their clothes, black jeans and fitted shirts, weren't suited for the Texas heat. One of them adjusted his watch, a slow, deliberate movement. A signal. Apollo let out a low, rumbling growl. Frank and Martha exchanged wary glances, subtly shifting to stand closer to the lemonade stand. "Good afternoon," the taller man said, his voice coated in an accent possibly Mexican or Central American. His companion remained silent, scanning the area. "Would you like some lemonade?" Charlotte chirped innocently. The taller man's lips curved into a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe next time, little one." Then, with a final glance at Apollo, they turned and walked back to the SUV. The vehicle sped away down the street. Lucia Morales, a local police officer, pulled up in her patrol car just as they disappeared. She stepped out, her keen eyes immediately taking in Apollo's rigid stance, the tension in Martha and Frank's faces, and Charlotte's blissful ignorance. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her gaze flicking toward the direction the SUV had gone. "Just some new visitors," Frank muttered. "The kind we don't usually see in Pine Creek." Apollo's ears perked forward. His nose twitched as if catching a scent on the breeze. Officer Morales knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Anything to report, old friend?" she whispered. Apollo let out the faintest whine. Lucia straightened, keeping her voice light for Charlotte's sake. "You know what? I think I'll take my break right here today. Mind if I join you for a bit, Charlotte?" Charlotte clapped her hands. "That would be awesome. You can help me sell lemonade." Lucia smiled, but as she took a sip from her cup, her mind was already racing. Something wasn't right. Across the street, in the window of Martha's antique shop, a closed sign had just been flipped. Another business shutting down. Another warning ignored. And none of them realized yet. This lemonade stand was about to change everything. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over Pine Creek, Texas. The small town, nestled between sprawling farmlands and rolling hills, had always been a place where everyone knew everyone. It was the kind of town where neighbors looked out for each other, where doors were left unlocked, and where a child's lemonade stand was just another sign of small-town charm. Charlotte Davis, 8 years old and full of boundless energy, was the kind of girl who could talk anyone into buying lemonade, whether they were thirsty or not. With her curly blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and an oversized sun hat, she was a picture of childhood innocence. But Charlotte was more than just a little girl selling drinks on a summer afternoon. She was determined, business-minded, and above all, fearless. Her lemonade stand had become something of a town tradition. Every summer, she would set it up at the same spot, right on the corner near Martha Stevens' antique shop and across from Frank Cooper's hardware store. Regular customers would stop by not just for the lemonade, but for the conversation, the gossip, and the warm familiarity that made Pine Creek feel like home. And then there was Apollo. To most people, Apollo was just Charlotte's dog, a large, imposing German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes and a sleek coat of black and tan. But to those who knew his history, Apollo was a legend. Before he had become Charlotte's best friend, Apollo had been one of the most decorated canine officers in Texas history. He had worked alongside Michael Davis, Charlotte's father, in the state's top narcotics division, sniffing out hidden drugs, tracking fugitives, and taking down criminals with a precision that few human officers could match. But after a long and distinguished career, Apollo had retired. And instead of spending his days in a kennel, he had been adopted by the Davis family, where his only job now was to watch over Charlotte. And he took that job very seriously. Even now, as Charlotte happily handed out lemonade to Officer Lucia Morales, Apollo's sharp eyes never stopped scanning the street. His muscles remained tense, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. His ears twitched at every passing vehicle. He remembered the black SUV from earlier. He didn't like it. "Did you see those men before?" Lucia asked casually, sipping her lemonade. Charlotte shook her head. "Nope. But they didn't buy anything. Maybe they don't like lemonade." Lucia exchanged a glance with Frank, who had been standing nearby, arms crossed. "Yeah," he muttered, "or maybe they weren't here for lemonade." Apollo let out a soft growl, barely audible, but Lucia heard it. She had spent enough years on the force to know one thing. When a retired police dog growls, you pay attention. Lucia Morales had been in Pine Creek for almost 6 years, transferring from El Paso after a border patrol assignment that nearly cost her life. She was tough, sharp, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer. But despite her experience, she had come to appreciate the slower pace of small-town life. Pine Creek had become home, and that's why she didn't like what she was seeing. Cartels didn't just show up in towns like this, not unless they had a reason. The problem was, Pine Creek wasn't just a town. It was a perfect corridor. Remote enough that law enforcement presence was minimal, close enough to the state highway to allow for easy movement of goods, and with just the right mix of struggling businesses that could be bought, pressured, or replaced with cartel fronts. And now, businesses were closing. One by one. The Martinez family's grocery store had been the first. Then the old bookstore on Main Street. Just this morning, she had seen the closed for business sign in the window of the Stevens antique shop. Martha Stevens, the town's sweet, elderly shop owner, wasn't the kind of person to just pack up and leave. Something was happening. Lucia looked down at Apollo, who was still watching the road, his body tense but controlled. He was trained not to react unless necessary, but his eyes were tracking something. Michael Davis, Charlotte's father, had taught her a long time ago, if Apollo moves, you move. Michael had seen things he didn't talk about in public. Retired now, he had once been one of the best narcotics officers in Texas, leading a specialized task force against major drug operations. He had spent years fighting cartels before finally stepping away, choosing to settle in Pine Creek for a quieter life with his wife Patricia and their daughter. But Michael knew better than anyone cartels don't forget. That's why, when he pulled into his driveway that evening and saw Lucia waiting for him, leaning against her patrol car, he wasn't surprised. "They were at the lemonade stand today," she said without preamble. Black SUV. Tinted windows. Two guys, dressed too sharp for a Texas summer. Michael didn't say anything at first. He just looked toward the house, where Charlotte was laughing on the porch with Apollo beside her, the dog's eyes still on the street. "They made a mistake," he finally said. Lucia nodded. "Yeah. And they don't even know it yet." Because what cartel members didn't realize was that they had just chosen the wrong town. And more importantly, they had just messed with the wrong dog. The next morning, Pine Creek felt different. The town still looked the same. The sun still bathed the streets in golden light. The scent of fresh coffee still drifted from Tom Wilson's diner. And Charlotte still set up her lemonade stand with the same enthusiasm. But something had shifted. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken tension hanging over the town like a storm cloud. Michael Davis noticed it the moment he stepped outside. It wasn't just in the way Frank Cooper stood outside his hardware store, pretending to adjust a display while keeping an eye on the street. It was in how Martha Stevens hesitated before unlocking her shop, glancing up and down the road before flipping the sign to open. It was in how Apollo, usually content to lounge beside Charlotte's stand, was standing today, his stance more rigid, his ears twitching at every sound. And then there were the cars. Not just any cars, the wrong kind of cars. Out-of-state plates. Tinted windows. Vehicles that didn't belong. At precisely 9:07 a.m., the black SUV returned. Michael was watching from his porch when it pulled up to the curb near the lemonade stand. Two men stepped out, one of them the same as yesterday, the other new. The new one was taller, leaner, with a sharp jawline and cold, calculating eyes. He adjusted his cufflinks, the movement slow, deliberate, a man used to being in control. Apollo's ears flattened. "Morning, gentlemen," Charlotte said cheerfully. "Would you like some lemonade?" The taller man smiled, but it was a dead thing, all formality and no warmth. "You must be Charlotte," he said smoothly. His voice had a faint Mexican accent, but his English was flawless. "That's me," she said proudly. "And this must be Apollo." His eyes flicked to the dog. Apollo didn't move. He was still as a statue, watching. The man reached into his jacket, and three things happened at once. Michael stepped off his porch, moving fast. Lucia Morale's patrol car appeared at the end of the street. Apollo shifted, muscles tensing, ready to act. But the man only pulled out a business card. He placed it on the lemonade stand, tapping it twice with his fingers. A little girl shouldn't be running a business alone. Accidents happen. He let the words hang in the air. And then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the SUV. Michael reached Charlotte a second too late. The vehicle was already pulling away. Charlotte picked up the card. "Daddy, what's Vega Imports?" Michael took it from her, his jaw tight. Lucia stepped out of her patrol car. "That's what we need to find out." But Michael already knew. The cartel wasn't just watching anymore. They were making their first move. Michael's fingers tightened around the business card as he stared at the sleek, black lettering, Vega Imports, Logistics and Distribution. A front. A cover for something much darker. He had seen these tactics before: innocuous businesses used as masks for criminal operations. A name just clean enough to stay off law enforcement radar until it was too late. And now, they had just left their mark on his daughter's lemonade stand. Lucia leaned in slightly. Vega Imports. Never heard of them. But I can guess what they're into. Her voice was low, controlled, but Michael could hear the edge in it. They don't just hand out cards, he murmured. This wasn't a warning. It was a statement. Charlotte looked between them, confused. Daddy? What's wrong? Michael forced a smile. Nothing, sweetheart. Why don't you help Mrs. Stevens inside for a minute? I need to talk to Officer Morales. Charlotte hesitated, but Apollo gently nudged her toward the antique shop. She giggled, patting his head before skipping off. But the moment she was gone, the tension snapped back into place like a coiled wire. Lucia exhaled. They're getting comfortable. That was bold. Michael nodded, glancing up and down the street. Too bold. They've already bought out half the businesses around here, but now they're moving faster. They're done with subtlety. Frank Cooper stepped up from the sidewalk, arms crossed. Martinez's family packed up last night. Didn't even say goodbye. You think that's a coincidence? Michael didn't. Neither did Lucia. They exchanged a look, one that spoke of unspoken understanding. The Martinez grocery store had been here for years. Families didn't just uproot overnight unless they had a damn good reason. Lucia muttered, "They're clearing the area, creating a vacuum." Michael ran a hand down his face. A safe corridor. They're pushing people out, buying businesses, setting up shop. That's why they're here. They're not passing through, they're moving in. Lucia's eyes darkened. And if they're moving in, they've already decided who stays and who goes. Michael didn't need her to elaborate. He knew exactly which category his family fell into. A sudden bark from Apollo snapped their attention back to the street. The German Shepherd stood alert, muscles taut, gaze locked onto a silver sedan idling across the road. The driver was barely visible through the tinted windows, but Michael could feel the stare. Frank muttered, "That one's new." Lucia's hand rested on her holster. "They're testing us." Michael's jaw clenched. He had spent years hunting men like this, and he knew exactly what was happening. They weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. And the worst part? They weren't afraid. The next evening, just as the sun began to dip below the rooftops of Pine Creek, the first real threat arrived. Charlotte had just finished serving a customer when the black SUV returned. This time, it didn't slow down. It swerved toward the lemonade stand, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Apollo moved first. Before anyone could react, the German Shepherd lunged, placing himself between Charlotte and the oncoming vehicle. His deep, guttural bark rang through the street like a warning shot. Michael, who had been watching from the porch, was already moving. He sprinted forward, pulling Charlotte away just as the SUV came to an abrupt halt inches from the stand. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, his expression unreadable behind a pair of dark sunglasses. Lucia's patrol car skidded to a stop at the opposite end of the street, her hand already on her weapon. "Evening, officer," the man said smoothly. His voice carried a calm, practiced indifference, the kind that came from someone who had done this before. Lucia didn't blink. "You almost ran over a kid. You want to explain that?" The man smirked. "Brakes must be going bad. You know how it is. Small towns, bad mechanics." Michael's blood boiled. His grip on Charlotte tightened as he pushed her toward Martha Stevens, who had rushed out of her shop. Apollo hadn't moved, his body still tense, his eyes locked onto the man. The driver tilted his head slightly. "Nice dog." Michael stepped forward. "You need to leave now." The smirk never faded. But something in the man's stance shifted. For a brief second, Michael saw the real intention behind this encounter. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a test. The man wanted to see who would react. And more importantly, how far he could push. Without another word, the driver turned, climbed back into the SUV, and peeled away down the road. Lucia watched them go, her knuckles white around her radio. They're getting impatient. Michael exhaled sharply. No. They're getting desperate. Apollo let out a low growl, his gaze still on the direction the SUV had disappeared. And Michael knew with a certainty that made his stomach turn, this wasn't over. That night, Pine Creek wasn't the same. The streets were quieter than usual, businesses closed earlier, and neighbors spoke in hushed tones on their porches. The town felt different, as if it knew trouble was coming. Michael sat on his porch, a loaded pistol resting on the table beside him, his eyes fixed on the dark road. Apollo lay at his feet, silent but alert, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Lucia had spent the past few hours making rounds, speaking with local business owners. The pattern was clear. The cartel was applying pressure, making offers that couldn't be refused. And for those who resisted, threats. At exactly 11:43 p.m., Michael's phone buzzed. A text from Lucia, "They're back." Michael didn't need to ask who they were. A moment later, Apollo lifted his head, ears perked. Something was outside. Michael moved quickly but quietly, stepping into the shadows of his front yard. His gut twisted as he spotted two figures standing near the lemonade stand, silhouetted against the dim glow of a street lamp. One of them was the man from earlier, the one who had nearly run over Charlotte. The other was new, shorter but broader, his stance heavier, more aggressive. Michael had seen men like them before. Soldiers. Enforcers. The kind who didn't make threats, they carried them out. Before he could act, a low, warning growl rumbled from Apollo's throat. The men turned. For a second, there was silence. Then, the shorter man chuckled. "That's a hell of a dog," he muttered. The taller man smirked. "Shame if something happened to it." Michael stepped forward, his voice cold. "That's close enough." The taller man held up his hands. "Relax, amigo. We're just here to talk." Michael's fingers tightened around the grip of his pistol. "You already talked. We're not interested." The shorter man sighed, shaking his head. "That's the problem with small towns. You all think you have a choice." Apollo took a step forward, his body lowering into a hunter's stance. His deep growl cut through the air like a blade. The two men hesitated. "You see," the taller man continued, but there was something new in his voice now, uncertainty. "We don't want any trouble." Michael's eyes didn't waver. "Then walk away." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, the taller man exhaled, glancing at his partner before taking a slow step back. "Have it your way." They turned and disappeared into the night. But as they walked away, the shorter man muttered just loud enough for Michael to hear, "Enjoy your time with your daughter while you can." Michael's stomach turned to ice. Apollo watched them go, his body still rigid, his breath slow and controlled. He wasn't just a dog, he was a trained weapon, and he had just locked onto his target. Michael knelt beside him, resting a hand on his fur. "It's starting, boy," he whispered. Apollo's ears flicked, but his eyes never left the road. He already knew. By sunrise, Michael was already awake, sipping his third cup of coffee, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He had spent hours reviewing old case files, searching for anything that might connect Vega Imports to La Siembra Negra, the cartel he had spent years hunting before retirement. He knew their tactics, their movements, their playbook. And he knew one thing for certain: once they made a threat, they followed through. Lucia arrived just after 6, walking in without knocking. "They're getting sloppy," she said, tossing a folder onto the table. I had my guys pull records on Vega imports. Officially, they're clean. Unofficially? Shell companies, offshore accounts, and an owner who doesn't exist. Michael flipped through the documents. Fake permits. Questionable wire transfers. A web of fraudulent businesses, all leading back to one single entity, a name Michael hadn't heard in years. Marco El Tiger Hernandez. He exhaled sharply. I put this bastard away 5 years ago. Lucia's expression darkened. Looks like he's out. Michael clenched his jaw. And now he's in my town. A sharp bark cut through the room. Apollo stood by the window, ears forward, muscles tense. A second later, Michael's phone buzzed a text from Frank Cooper. 2 more businesses shut down overnight. People are scared. Michael rose from his chair, his gut tightening. They're closing in. Lucia nodded. Then it's time we push back. Michael and Lucia didn't waste time. By midday, they were sitting in a dimly lit back room of Tom Wilson's diner, surrounded by a handful of trusted locals, Frank Cooper, Martha Stevens, and Officer Chin from the Sheriff's Department. A map of Pine Creek lay spread across the table, red circles marking the businesses that had shut down in the past month. The pattern was unmistakable. They're pushing inward, Lucia muttered, running a finger along the marked locations. They've already cleared out half the town. If this keeps up, we'll wake up one morning and realize Pine Creek isn't ours anymore. Frank exhaled sharply. Then what do we do? Wait until they start shooting. Michael shook his head. No. We cut them off before they get comfortable. Right now, they think they own the board, but they don't know we're watching too. Martha, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. I'm not leaving. Her voice was firm, unwavering. I've lived in this town for 60 years. I won't be scared out of my home. Michael met her gaze. Then we fight. A knock at the back door made everyone tense. Apollo was on his feet instantly, moving before Michael even gave a command. Lucia pulled her sidearm, stepping toward the door, but Michael waved her off. It's okay. He opened the door to reveal Patricia Davis, his wife, her face pale but determined. She wasn't alone. Standing beside her was Rosa Martinez, the teenage daughter of the grocery store owners who had left in the middle of the night. They didn't leave because they wanted to, Patricia said. They were forced out. Rosa's eyes were red, her hands clenched into fists. My parents didn't want trouble. But those men, her voice cracked. They told my father if he didn't sell the store, they'd take me instead. Silence. Michael inhaled slowly. Do you know where they're operating from? Rosa nodded. They took over the old furniture store on Mill Street. But it's not just a store. She looked at Lucia. They built something underneath it. Lucia's eyes narrowed. A storage facility? Rosa swallowed hard. More than that. Tunnels. Michael exchanged a look with Lucia. That changed everything. Frank muttered a curse. They've been planning this for months. Michael turned back to Rosa. Can you show us exactly where? Rosa hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Lucia pushed back from the table. Then let's move. Michael looked at Apollo, who was still watching the door, ears twitching, muscles taut. The dog knew something big was coming. Michael exhaled. Yeah, boy. He reached down, scratching behind Apollo's ears. It's starting. The air was thick with tension as Michael, Lucia, and a handful of officers parked 2 blocks away from the old furniture store on Mill Street. The building sat in near darkness, its once familiar clearance sale sign now faded and forgotten. But this wasn't a furniture store anymore. This was a nerve center, a place where La Sombra Negra had set up shop right under their noses. And now, thanks to Rosa's information, Michael knew exactly what was beneath it. Tunnels. Storage rooms. A smuggling route buried beneath their town. Michael crouched beside Lucia behind an abandoned truck, Apollo at his side, ears perked, muscles coiled like a spring. The dog wasn't just watching, he was listening, tracking every movement inside the building. Lucia exhaled. We go in quiet. No sirens. No warnings. If they figure out we're onto them before we get inside, we lose our only chance to take them down clean. Michael nodded. And if it goes loud? Lucia's grip tightened on her weapon. Then we make sure they don't get out. She gave the signal. Officer Chun and his team flanked the back entrance, while Michael and Lucia moved toward the side door, Apollo trotting silently beside them. Michael tested the handle unlocked. A mistake. A sign they felt untouchable. He pushed the door open slowly, revealing a dimly lit hallway leading deeper into the building. The faint scent of chemicals and damp earth lingered in the air. Drugs. Packaging. Transportation. The cartel wasn't just moving product through Pine Creek. They were processing it here. Lucia motioned forward, and they moved in. In the distance, voices echoed from deeper inside, men speaking in Spanish, discussing shipments, bribes, and routes. They were comfortable, unaware that danger had just walked through their front door. Apollo suddenly stiffened, his body going rigid, his nose flaring. Then a low growl. Michael barely had time to register the movement before Apollo lunged. A figure had stepped from a side room, weapon raised, but before he could even aim, Apollo was on him, teeth sinking into his forearm, twisting, forcing the gun away. The man screamed, but Lucia was already moving, slamming the butt of her gun into his skull, dropping him before he could get another sound out. Michael grabbed Apollo's harness, pulling him back. "Good boy," he whispered. But now, the house was awake. Shouts rang out from deeper inside. Footsteps. Weapons being drawn. The fight had begun. Gunfire erupted from deeper inside the building. Michael and Lucia ducked behind a stack of old furniture as bullets ripped through wooden crates, sending splinters flying. Apollo stayed low, his ears twitching, his sharp instincts processing every threat at once. The cartel was reacting fast, too fast. They had lookouts. Someone had tipped them off. Lucia fired 2 shots down the hallway, forcing the gunman to retreat. "We need to move before they regroup," she hissed. Michael nodded. "We take the tunnels. If Rosa was right, they're using them to move product. That's where we cut them off." Apollo led the way, his body tense but controlled, his paws silent against the concrete floor. They passed through a loading area where stacks of unmarked boxes sat waiting. Michael's gut twisted. If the D got their hands on this inventory, it would bury the cartel's operation. They reached a metal hatch in the floor, the entrance to the tunnels. Lucia knelt, running a gloved hand over the bolts. "Unlocked," she muttered. They were in a hurry. Michael gritted his teeth. That means they're already moving out. Before he could react, Apollo's ears flattened, a split-second warning. A shadow moved behind them. Michael spun just as a cartel enforcer lunged from the darkness, knife flashing in the dim light. But Apollo was faster. He launched himself at the man's throat, knocking him to the ground with a force that made the air explode from his lungs. The knife clattered to the floor as Apollo pinned him, snarling, fangs bared. Lucia aimed her gun at the downed man's head. "Stay down." Michael's heart pounded as he grabbed Apollo's harness, pulling him back. "Good boy," he whispered again. But there was no time to celebrate. Footsteps echoed from inside the tunnel. More cartel members. More threats. Lucia gave him a look. "You still want to go down there?" Michael checked his ammo. "You got a better idea?" Lucia smirked. "Nope." Together, they yanked open the hatch and descended into the dark. The air in the tunnel was thick, damp, and laced with the faint scent of chemicals and sweat. The walls were lined with wooden support beams, old but sturdy, stretching into the darkness. Michael moved forward cautiously, his gun raised, his breath steady. Lucia followed close behind, her own weapon ready, while Apollo led the way, his nose working overtime, ears twitching at every distant sound. Somewhere ahead, cartel members were moving fast, their hurried footsteps echoing off the stone walls. They were running, not fighting. That meant one thing: they were moving something important. Michael whispered, "They're cutting their losses. They know we're onto them." Lucia nodded. "We can't let them escape." Apollo froze. His tail stiffened, his stance lowering. Michael barely had time to register the warning before a gunshot rang out, the bullet whizzing past his head, striking the tunnel wall behind him. They dived for cover. A second shot roared through the tunnel, but this time Apollo moved. He darted forward with silent precision, closing the distance between him and the gunman before the man could fire again. With a powerful leap, Apollo collided with the shooter, his weight knocking the man to the ground. The gun went off, but the shot buried itself into the dirt ceiling, harmless. Lucia was there in a second, kicking the gun away, pressing her knee into the man's back as she cuffed him. Michael exhaled sharply, glancing down the tunnel. The other cartel members had vanished into the dark. Michael grabbed Apollo's harness. "We're not done yet, boy." They ran. The tunnel opened up into a hidden storage facility, a massive underground chamber, lined with shelves stacked with bricks of drugs, cash, and weapons. And in the center of it all, Victor Ruiz stood waiting. Marco El Tiger Hernandez was beside him, flanked by two armed men. Ruiz sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "You've been quite the problem, Captain Davis." Michael didn't hesitate. "And you've been quite the coward, hiding in tunnels while your men do the dirty work." Ruiz's jaw tightened. "You think this changes anything?" He gestured around the room. "Kill one operation, another takes its place. That's the nature of the business." Michael stepped forward, his gun locked on Ruiz. "Not in this town." Ruiz chuckled, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." Lucia smirked. "Funny. That's exactly what we were about to say." Before Ruiz could react, the sound of boots against concrete filled the air. D-agents flooded into the chamber, rifles raised, orders shouted. Ruiz's smug expression vanished. His men tried to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Marco lunged for a weapon, but before he could reach it, Apollo moved. The German shepherd struck with full force, teeth locking onto Marco's arm, dragging him to the ground. The enforcer screamed, struggling, but Apollo held firm until Michael moved in, kicking the gun away and slamming cuffs onto Marco's wrists. Ruiz barely had time to blink before he found himself face to face with Agent Claire Bennett, her badge gleaming under the dim tunnel lights. "You're under arrest," she said, snapping cuffs onto him. "And this time, there's no getting out." Ruiz exhaled slowly. He glanced at Michael one last time. "You don't understand." Michael tightened his grip on his gun. "Oh, I do." And with that, Ruiz was dragged away. It was over. 1 week later, Pine Creek was different now. Lighter. Safer. The tension that had settled over the town for weeks had lifted. Businesses reopened. Families returned. The people had fought back and won. Charlotte's lemonade stand was back, sitting on its familiar corner. A new hand-painted sign reading, "Charlotte and Apollo's famous lemonade, now FBI approved." Michael watched from the porch as Charlotte giggled, pouring lemonade for a line of officers, townsfolk, and even a few D-agents. Apollo sat beside her, wearing a brand new collar with a gold tag that read, "Pine Creek's Finest." Lucia walked up, arms crossed, shaking her head. "So, what's next for Captain Davis? Back to retirement?" Michael smirked. "I think I'll stick around." Lucia chuckled. "Good. Because something tells me this town could use someone like you. Charlotte waved from her stand. Daddy, Apollo needs a treat. Michael smiled. Yeah, sweetheart. He's earned it. Apollo wagged his tail, but his eyes still watched the road, ever vigilant. Because he knew, even in a town like Pine Creek, the fight for justice never really ends.